And I am hosting Ann Forstchen today. Ann she's a biologist and I'm a geologist. You might be asking yourself, how did this happen? And Ann and I are actually neighbors, and there's a lot of scientists around here in the St. Pete area. We met one evening, and when I was when I was in grad school, I was really interested, or actually not even that, I guess it was undergrad, I was really interested in this interface between science and policy and thought that it was something that I really wanted to do. And didn't end up working out that way with my studies, but when I got into this conversation with Ann, I realized that she's not necessarily at the interface between science and policy, but she does a lot to help people communicate their science and understand how to communicate their science so that other people know why what we do is important. And I work at the USGS. Clearly that's something that's very important to our agency as well. So, and Ann works at FWC, so clearly that's important to her institute as well. So I think it's a really important component of science that we don't spend a lot of time talking about. And this is inspired by a meeting of the American Geophysical Union that happened a couple years ago, where Al Gore spoke, and he was like, scientists need to do a better job of communicating their science about climate change, so there's no question that it's real or what's going on with it and everything like that. And I remember thinking there at the time that he said that, like, that's not my job to do that. Turns out, as scientists, it is our job to communicate our science, especially to people that we know, people that we meet, why our science is important and why we do what we do and how it affects people every day. So that's why I wanted to bring Ann in here, and that's why the geologists and biologists are hanging out. So Ann got her Bachelor of Science from Texas A&M. She got that in marine biology and marine technology, which is kind of a cool combination. She then received her MBA from the New York Institute of Technology. And she spent the last 24 years working at FWC or its predecessors in a variety of roles, such as the Marine Sport Fish Hatchery and Research Facility. She led the Marine Sport Fish Health Unit. She became the research coordinator for Fish and Wildlife, FWC's Fish and Wildlife Research Institute, and then moved into leading the Human Dimensions group. So that's who she's here representing today. And an interesting fact about Ann, she and her husband 14 months to renovate their bathroom. So she's clean today, which is the good part. So without further ado, here's Ann.
Okay, thanks. That was an interesting introduction, and Jen, thanks for inviting me. And I really want to talk about a little bit differently, or a different topic than normally I think what these seminars are. So I'm not going to be presenting any research findings, but more talking about how we think about why we do wildlife conservation and who we do it for. So let's start off with a quick I'd like to just get a general understanding of if you've heard of these concepts or these ideas. So just a show of hands, public trust doctrine. Anybody? Human dimensions of wildlife, and it doesn't count if you looked it up when you saw the seminar announcement. Okay, at least one there. And North American model of wildlife conservation. Anybody? One. Okay, well, don't feel bad. I didn't know about any of these until about 10 years ago. I came up through the marine fisheries side of conservation, and at least when I was going through school, concepts or these topics weren't discussed at all. I'm not sure if they are currently discussed in, at least on the marine side of conservation, but I suspect it's still heavily just focused on the terrestrial side of conservation. My job at FWC is to increase staff awareness of what human dimensions is and to help staff understand how we can use some of the principles of the public trust doctrine and the North American model to improve our conservation outcomes. So just a few clarifications with some of the terminology that I'm going to be using. For me, conservation in North America is the full suite of research management and law enforcement that helps us protect and sustain and allow current legal use and enjoyment of fish and wildlife. And that's for now and for future generations as well. And conservation is achieved not just by the federal, state, local, and tribal governments, but it's also achieved through NGOs, academia, industry, private landowners, and citizen scientists. My definition of wildlife is very broad. It encompasses fish, wildlife, and invertebrates. And so as I talk about wildlife, I really am talking about fish and wildlife. And for stakeholders, stakeholders are people who are significantly affected by wildlife, or they significantly affect wildlife, and they can be a member of an organized group, or stakeholders can be just a single person. So why do we conserve wildlife? The simple answer is because people value wildlife, and we've created a management paradigm that reflects these values. It's embodied in the public trust doctrine and in the rules and regulations and in the policies that we develop. There's a long history of wildlife conservation in North America, but it's really focused on terrestrial wildlife. And our system of wildlife management, particularly in the U.S., is considered to be a unique system, and some people call it the most successful system in the world. But that can be a topic for a whole different seminar. But I think it's important to recognize that our system of wildlife management evolved because of a strong dislike of wildlife ownership and management in Europe by early American settlers. And some research on wildlife species is done purely for gaining expertise or knowledge about a particular species or ecosystem function. But there's usually a tie back into a human need or concern relative to our management of wildlife. And sometimes it's just because we like to consume wildlife species, so we put a lot of attention on some species like red snapper or grouper or white-tailed deer. Some we pay attention to because there's a unique characteristic of that animal that provides a human benefit, like horse crabs. And then other species, we just pay attention to them because we value wildlife and we value that they exist. So what is the public trust doctrine? Nobody can hand you a book or a piece of paper that says this is the doctrine. And that's because it's a collection of case law and legal authority. It's embedded within state constitutions, the charters of natural resource agencies like FWC. It's embedded in case law or rules and regulations that are enacted by legislative bodies or through state agencies like FWC. It's a core concept that is pretty broad spread, but there's nuances in every state. Every state has its own case law and its own wildlife management history. So there's basically 50 flavors plus the federal government flavor of the public trust doctrine. But boiled down, the doctrine is that it states that certain natural resources are held in trust for the benefit of people. And I won't go into the very long history of the development of the public trust doctrine, but it's not a new concept. Its origins are embedded in ancient Greek natural law, and it was really formalized in the U.S. in 1842 Supreme Court ruling regarding sovereign submerged lands. And it wasn't until the late 1800s that the public trust doctrine was being applied to wildlife resources. So there's been a small group of us over the past couple of years that have been looking at the public trust doctrine and trying to determine the potential for the doctrine to provide guidance and actions for state wildlife agencies. And we've kind of boiled down the principles of the doctrine into these principles, in that fish and wildlife are public resources. They're managed for the common good, that means for all citizens, now and for future generations. And they're managed so that one group is not favored over another, and that they're managed by trained professionals. So the public trust doctrine provides the legal framework and guidance for how fish and wildlife are managed and conserved. And most of the responsibility for state wildlife, or for wildlife management, is held by the state. The feds have some responsibility for critically imperiled species, and we share the management of some of those species. And the governments can delegate certain management actions to conserve fish and wildlife. Still, the government is still the responsible party. So how is this realistically put into practice? Agencies turn to good governance principles, and this is the way organizations make decisions, form and carry out policies, and exercise their authority. Good governance has taken a sort of a front and center role in the last 10 or 20 years, more accountable, open, transparent governance. And good governance is described as being inclusive, participatory, equitable, accountable, efficient, and representative. And to do these things well, we have to understand people better. So hopefully, some of you might remember this from some of your earlier coursework, but this is really the essence of wildlife management, these three separate sectors. We do a pretty good job of the wildlife population part and habitats and the environment. And it's just been in the last 20 or 30 years that we're paying specific and explicit attention to this human sector. And this is what Human Dimensions is. It's paying attention and understanding the people part of wildlife management. Ultimately, wildlife management is about decision making. Wildlife persists because we want it to. And as a society, we've decided that we've put into place policies and rules and regulations that ensure that the populations do persist. An example of this is the Endangered Species Act. That makes sure that there's plans and guidance for the recovery and management of critically endangered species. We also make choices about harvesting some particular species like white-tailed deer or grouper or red snapper, so we make choices with that. And those populations that we choose to harvest, we make sure that those populations can sustain that harvest level. We also make choices about moving or euthanizing an individual animal if they're presenting harm or danger to people. And a good example of that is bears and alligators in Florida. I often hear about that wildlife management is science-based, and I think that's a myth, because science doesn't tell us what to do. Science informs our decision-making. And so at FWC, we try and promote the concept of science-informed decision-making or science-informed management rather than science-based. And we need to recognize that those decisions need to incorporate both ecological and social sciences. And decisions are based on human values, and those values are influenced by people's interactions and impacts from wildlife. So this is a contemporary definition that captures the essence of wildlife management and provides a philosophical basis for why we pay attention to the people part. Key elements of this definition are the informed decision-making, socially acceptable practices, influencing interactions, and achieving impacts valued by stakeholders. And if you think about this, if it's a definition for wildlife management, but the focus is really on people. So values, very simply, human values are the reason for wildlife management. And this is such a fundamental thought that we rarely sort of think about it, take it out and look at it and talk about that really is the reason for management. And we've known this for quite some time, but it's hard for wildlife managers to really understand human values and how those connect with their management actions. So Human Dimensions research helps managers understand the human values that drive attitudes, opinions, and behaviors towards wildlife. So values are the reason for management, but impacts are the focus of management. Natural resource agencies, none of us, even if we combined all of our forces, would have the resources to study and monitor every species and every habitat. So we have to prioritize our time, talent, and treasure to the things that are most important to stakeholders. So by using an impacts-based paradigm, that helps state agencies and managers focus their activities on things that are important to managers. And over the years, we've been able to categorize impacts into these 5 different categories of impacts, and an impact can be in more than one of these characters or categories. So what are impacts? Impacts are a subset of both positive and negative outcomes from the interactions of people, fish, wildlife, or their habitats that are recognized by stakeholders, and that's an important piece, that they're recognized by stakeholders, and also that they're important enough that they warrant agency attention. So impacts can be positive. They can be something like going out and catching, releasing a fish, or harvesting your catch and having a nice seafood dinner. Another less hands-on example of positive impacts of wildlife is wildlife viewing. And people also derive value from just knowing that wildlife exists. My mom lives in Michigan, but she likes sea turtles. She's not likely ever going to see one in the wild or interact with one, but she derives a value from that by knowing that they exist. And then there are negative impacts of wildlife. There can be direct negative impacts, such as a bear tearing a hole in your pool enclosure to get a drink, getting into your garbage, feral hogs ripping up your lawn, beavers cutting down trees, fruit trees in your orchard, monk parakeets impacting power lines, deer eating your potted plants. I mean, there's a whole number of direct impacts from wildlife. Fear of interacting with wildlife is also a negative impact. Again, my mom in Michigan, she doesn't like to drive certain roads at night because she's afraid of hitting a deer. Increasingly in some areas of Florida, people are afraid to let small pets and children out alone because of the real or perceived fear of negative interactions with bears or coyotes. So human dimensions research is rigorous science inquiry that attempts to describe, understand, and predict human thought and behaviors. And HD research asks the why as well as the what questions. HD draws from a large number of the social science fields, but really relies mostly on sociology, social psychology, and economics. The HD term was coined in 1973, and there were a number of work groups that got together as this discipline was really being shaped. In the mid-'70s and early '70s, there was some scientific inquiry, not a lot of stakeholder engagement, but it was really focused on our traditional stakeholders, the hunters, anglers, and trappers. And as time went on, the scientific inquiry broadened into more non-traditional stakeholders. We're still struggling with this in reaching out to new and emerging stakeholder groups and understanding their needs and concerns. And again, stakeholder involvement kind of went along that same time frame. The first HD conference was in 1987. The premier Human Dimensions Research Unit is at Cornell University, and that began about 35 years ago. The other major hub of HD research is at Colorado State, and that started about 20 years ago. There are numerous HD programs around the country now. Almost all of the big land-grant schools like Texas A&M, University of Wisconsin, University of Georgia. I mean, there's a whole suite of schools that have HD programs. There's a growing program at University of Florida that just started a couple years ago, and it's being partially funded by FWC. So scholarship on human dimensions of wildlife really took off in the 1980s, and articles were published in the mainstream wildlife journals like the Wildlife Society Bulletin and Journal of Wildlife Management. And then as some of these others came online, like Society of Natural Resources and Conservation Biology, they were picking up some HD articles as well. Human Dimensions Wildlife Journal started in '96, and they publish now 6 times a year and often have 1 or 2 special issues. So, there's now courses available at the undergraduate and graduate level on human dimensions, and there's a textbook that goes along with those courses. So wildlife management relies on human dimensions information to inform decision by improving knowledge of how people value wildlife, what benefits stakeholders want from wildlife, the social acceptability of some of our wildlife management practices, and how stakeholders affect or are affected by wildlife. There are 2 main approaches to human dimensions studies, and one is through social science inquiry, and the other is through stakeholder engagement. And these are generally used in combination, and they support and complement each other. And again, the social science inquiry really relies on these 3 aspects. So sociologists study values, cultural norms, and social structures external to the individual rather than relying or studying on individual behaviors. And sociology provides valuable insight into drivers that influence perceptions or acceptance of wildlife management. Social psychology is the study of way in which people are influenced by their environment or others, and it's how people's thoughts, feelings, and behaviors are influenced by actual or imagined or implied presence of others or their environment. So social psychology seeks to understand and predict and explain individual behaviors, such as why is this woman feeding a bear? So we need to recognize that stakeholders each has a unique lens about how they view these resources. If you're taking white-tailed deer as an example, some people may look at them as a wildlife viewing opportunity. Hunters may see it as a conquest for trophy antlers or to put meat on the table. And others, such as an ecologist, might see white-tailed deer as an indicator of ecosystem functioning. This drawing came from a 1950 monograph out of Michigan, and at the time, the Wildlife Management Agency was putting into practice regulations and opportunities to increase the deer herd. But at the same time, the agricultural land uses in Michigan were really changing the landscape, and the amount of available early successional habitat dramatically decreased. So you had this combination of the forage base dropping dramatically and the population increasing dramatically, and it resulted in huge numbers of deer starving to death. And so this really demonstrated to wildlife managers that they had to look more broadly, not just at the biology of the critter, but look at what's happening in society and how that impacts wildlife management. And then we have to understand that there's a social caring capacity or a social acceptance capacity for wildlife. And I don't know if people in the back can see this, but in the first panel, the man says, look, a deer in the woods, and the woman says, she's beautiful, let's build a house here. So in the second panel, they're in the house, and the man says, look, a deer in the flower garden, and the woman says, shoot it. So we have to really take into account that that social acceptance of wildlife changes over time depending on circumstances and how people